Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tech Connect podcast. I'm your host, Tawhida Ali, and today we'll be talking about tech and climate change activism, and we have a guest with us. I'll let him introduce himself.
Okay, I'm not an activist. I'm not an activist, so yeah, but of course we'll try to talk about that as well. But yeah, my name is Nick Kanali.
So on today's podcast, we'll be talking about various things in the tech and climate change sector, like ESG in the digital age, green startups, climate innovation in Africa. So to start off, my first question to you, do you think ESG reporting is becoming more about impact or just optics in the age of social media?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, considering even for us here in-house, anything about ESG, sustainability has become a very, very important part of the content we cover, right? I think when you look back from first when people started having conversations around ESG, climate change, one will say a lot of people are doing it just for the, as you said, for the optics and just social media, because let's do this because other people are actually
doing it.
Yeah. But, as the years have gone by, that's actually it's changing, because now it's becoming, a requirement as a company to declare your ESG practices when you need to release reporting around this. So it has moved from all this, optics and social media to now just being a requirement for a lot of organizations just across the world and across Africa.
Yeah.
Yes.
Talking about that, we also see that a lot of corporate companies are switching to ESG. Mm-hmm. So what does it look like in today's digital first world, considering that even banks nowadays have the sustainability report yearly? Mm-hmm. So what does it look like in today's digital first world?
Digital first world. Okay, as I said earlier, it's not becoming a requirement. Look at it, for example, from, let me say a tech company, trying to audit its carbon footprint. Actually, ESG, anything around sustainability has become very complicated. At times you talk to people about carbon credits.
It looks complex.
Exactly. Carbon footprints, but look at it, for example, how do you, in practice, right, as a fintech startup or a fintech company or a bank, how are you just embedding, let's say, things like financial inclusions directly into your product KPI? So look at it from that point. So it's not just the CSR. Actually, Kitambo, it used to be the CSR projects that are being referred to as ESG Manini, because you've gone to a school, donated books. That was, but again, in the digital world, that is changing because, we need to measure those ESG practices. What did you use to measure? So a lot of digital platforms are coming up to actually being used to measure these things. So tech has really helped to change how people actually measure these things. It's not just reporting, it's just, again, measuring. But again, how do you measure that? Or do you do that just when you use digital platforms?
It's more of like seeing the impact of it.
Yes, the impact, of it. So, in fact, these days, ESG is now increasingly including things like digital equity. Think about who has access to your products. Are you building for the 300 billion internet users across the world who actually come to use your products? So digital access, digital privacy are part of actually that as well. So when you talk about digital, digital first world, talk about digital privacy, digital access, and who actually are you building that product for?
Yeah.
Yes.
And are African companies approaching ESG differently compared to global tech giants?
Are they? I think it's almost the same practice across the world. How we measure ESG, how we measure our sustainability practices, it's almost being done the same way, okay? So, you've seen like global tech companies, like in Amazon, and you look at it like in Meta, they've built very massive carbon-heavy data centers. They have scaled their businesses, aggressively, across Africa. But again, as the years go by, as I said earlier, they have moved back and thought about, okay, we actually need to talk about sustainability as well. How do we include sustainability as part of this growth that we are talking about? So I think for most of global companies, ESG was like, let's do it because it was Nikama damage control or for PR purposes. But again, when you look at African countries, they are doing it, or African organizations, they are doing it from a totally different, actually, context from just day one. So, first, Africa, we are very lucky.
Yeah.
Talk about grid, talk about solar, we are very lucky. So African companies are building these products, or these are actually embedding these practices, in countries where this grid or this solar is actually there. Actually, when you travel across these different countries, huko watajua watu hawanangi. So when you talk about solar, it's a totally, totally, totally.
It's a new topic.
Yes, it's a new topic. But now in Africa, it's now becoming a business necessity because, you have the solar, you have the sun. Let's just make use of it. So, many, African startups, we were at Africa Tech Summit the other day, we saw a lot of them actually there as well. They are building with their communities in mind. Ukitembea huku nje, you'll find someone with easy simus, these are solar, they're always there. You go, companies like M-Copper, wanapeana small solars into communities, across the country. So a lot of African countries, African organizations actually building these products with their community in mind. So products actually communities inaweza tumia. As well, of course, kuna places where these companies need to grow, especially when it comes to, ESG governance, which is a big issue. But again, I think the difference that we are doing as Africans, the difference that Africans are doing is the fact that, they are building these products or they are just measuring their sustainability practices with the African in mind. Yes. Yeah. At least they know what's happening on ground.
Because right now, if I go to someone who is not who doesn't have much knowledge about solar, he won't miss a clue about anything of what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Even with the tech that we are having in Africa, they have a clue of what's happening.
Yeah.
What do you think is one ESG myth people still believe that needs to be challenged?
I think the fact that, ESG is really costly. I think a lot of people think when they're building sustainably or ethically, for example, they're sacrificing profitability. But actually, and I think that's why a lot of organizations, even small businesses, unapata kama even however small, for example, as we are like, okay, we can't take that direction because it's very, very costly. But again, when you look at banks or even institutions that have gone that route, they've been reporting massive profits. A lot of these banks, they are issuing, green financing loans, they are financing, electric vehicles. But when they release their reports, which we get to attend at times, they're releasing crazy profits. Yeah. So this myth, we can't afford to prioritize ESG. We are still focusing on growth. I think it's one thing that we need to actually, we need to challenge as African organizations and as especially banks. And the fact that it's now becoming mandatory, we just need to take that route. Yeah. So alafu there's also that thing, ESG is still fundamentally outdated. But again, as I said, when you look at companies that are, have strong ESG practices, they've been reporting massive profits, massive growth. So that's one thing that, we need to actually challenge as well. Because, ESG, we need to think about ESG, is about to just climate change. Inclusiveness, for example, how many female employees do you have, all those things, how do you balance all these things? When you follow all these practices as an organization, it means you're following the legal or regulatory way as well, meaning you're spending less money because you're not doing this and this. Yeah. And what happens is you end up saving more money for your organization. So, it's it helps you cut on operational costs. Again, strong practices actually improve, employee retention. You're looking at, of course, increased revenue driver, not just cost consideration. And also, we've seen investors that have, want you to include, ESG performance in your reporting. Yeah. So we can release reports, they want to see you include, ESG performance as part of that report. And when you do that, it means you are gaining their trust and they're able to give you more money.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, to you grow.
So we talked about big companies like Amazon and Meta talking about being carbon neutral. So do you think these big tech companies should be doing more, or are they already leading in the climate conversation?
I wish I had access to some of these companies in-house. But when you see companies like Google, for example, talk about being carbon neutral by 2027, what it basically means is they have been purchasing enough carbon offsets and renewable energy certificates to technically just balance their emissions on paper, right? But again, that's totally different from just you physically or actually just eliminating those emissions. We've seen Microsoft actually just being very, very ambitious, with the same thing, committing to be carbon negative by 2030. I picked up from my notes here, and removing all the historical emissions by 2050. I mean, all these are very, very bold claims by these companies, and they're very, very bold and very good ambitions. But again, is it enough? Are we actually seeing them doing that? Okay. Maybe my honest response to that will be, yeah, they're making good progress, which they should, being the big tech, the tech giants. They're making good progress, of course, faster than well a lot of all these industries are doing. But they're doing this because for them they have money, they have the access, they have the capacity to actually do these things.
They also have enough infrastructure.
Yes, they have enough infrastructure. Maybe what we need to do, as much as they're doing this, is just for us now, as for example the media or anything, to just hold them at higher standards. So let's not dismiss these efforts they're doing, or even not even just them, at any other companies here locally. When you see them doing this thing, let's not dismiss them, but let's just hold them to that higher standards, and just push them towards it always is accessibility, always call it the scope 3 transparency. So let's push them to actually just actual emission reductions, not just offsetting those purchases. So yeah, the ambition is real. They're trying, which is good, but they need to do more. But again, we should encourage them to actually just work more hard. Yes. Yeah.
So moving on, what are some of the most exciting climate-focused innovations coming from startups right now?
It's a lot, actually. It's a lot. Especially for Africa, we've seen a lot of things around carbon markets, carbon credits. Again, as I said, carbon credits not everyone understands. We've seen that being happening a lot. In fact, the whole idea of things like carbon credits, which is coming up as a very, very big thing, it became more actively. A lot of people started knowing more about carbon credits when the story of Cocoa Networks happened. Okay, what are carbon credits? Yeah. Also, there was another story around the same thing, and people started questioning, okay, what are carbon credits? Why do I need to sell you air? Why do I need to make profits from this thing? But actually, it's more to this. Maybe we just need a different episode on that. So you've seen that coming up very, very massively. Also, things to do with renewable energy, very, very big. Companies are investing a lot in renewable energy because they want to save on costs. I mean, electricity, especially Kenya, very, very expensive. So, how do we save energy? So, renewable energy is a big, big thing. We've seen startups like Sun King, which are going big on that as well. Mkopa doing the same. Then another thing maybe I would say is yes, exactly, e-mobility. That's what I was looking for. So e-mobility is very, very big, and I like the fact that for countries like Kenya, we already have, for example, the e-mobility policy. So we have government support on that area as well. We've seen a lot of companies like Bolt or any other company going big with EVs. We've seen a lot of local assembly companies coming to set up local EV assembly plants. I was
actually telling Caro about that. Like, if right now we had if the countries have invested more on EVs, I don't think if people will be having trouble, oil crisis that's happening right now with the war going on.
Yes,
I think people will need to worry about oil.
Yes, and trust me, as you say, some of us, I wish we had electric cars. They're just like, when you drive in one, unasikia tu yani uzuri sana. But you see, right now, kama say tuna story ya mafuta, people are really struggling. But again, if you have EVs, you won't have to worry about that. Good thing as well is We are seeing a lot of companies investing in charging infrastructure. But I like, for example, what companies like Basigo are doing with electric buses. Now they're thinking of, let's not just make those cars drive around Nairobi to Zipeleke outside Nairobi. So we have them they have Nissans moving around different towns. They have charging stations, Makueni. I saw them open as well. So it's a good direction we are taking.
Yeah.
Now they're thinking about doing the same actually for us, some of us who take 8 hours to go to Shanghai.
Yeah.
So we might have electric buses going the same. So, but again, as much as we are thinking about this, I think the more investment we need to do is on charging infrastructure to just help grow e-mobility. But yeah, so e-mobility, carbon credits, renewable energy are just one of the big thing we are seeing happening right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
And do you think small startups realistically compete with big corporations in solving climate change in Africa and globally?
Well, not only can they, in many ways actually, but I think they are better positioned to actually solve, certain types of climate challenges. So they can't really compete. And, of course, I'm not saying that to romanticize startups, but because the economics and dynamics actually support it, right? So we've seen, of course, big corporations, like we said earlier, Google, Microsoft. Those companies have very, very massive resources, okay? Yeah. They have crazy and just enormous, resources to actually do this. And of course, the existing revenue streams, they make so much money, are tied to current systems, right? So when you look, for example, at, a fossil startup or an energy startup, it has to genuinely just innovate itself from that small company into big. Yeah. So it's hard to really compete with big corporates, right? But again, startups, of course, they excel at last mile, which is what they always try to solve. Highly contextual solutions that large corporations just, can't profitably standardize. You see, it's hard for you to tell, for example, Meta or Microsoft, twendeni huko kwetu bana ushago, you do something. But it's easy for you to talk to a startup.
Yeah.
A local startup, okay, but you can actually expand into this area. So, like a company like Meta can't come here and solve, or Google can't come and solve energy problems, for example, in our rural homes, right? But again, these startups have access. They can actually do that. So, well, they can actually compete because they have access to these people and the resources, right? But again, in fact, when you look at the most successful, for example, climate startups in Africa, one thing I've seen is they are not really just trying to compete with corporations, but, they are making corporations their customers. Yeah. So you've seen a lot of, for example, companies investing, Kina Meta, Kina Google investing in energy climate startups in Africa, or even just using them their customer. Yeah. So they're not only just competing, they're also their customers. So, of course, that's one way a lot of these startups can just go head to head with a lot of these corporations.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what's one underrated green idea you think will blow up in the next few years?
That's actually, that's a hard one. But I think one that I see would really has to be something to do with the circular economy. Again, you see, sustainability, people just think about climate change, the climate. But again, it's big. The circular economy, especially for electronics. The story Caroline did, that is on the magazine on circular economy. There's also one you did on Eco, that company from Kilifi as well, yeah? So I think that's one area that we'll see grow over the coming years. So refurbishment, of ecosystem devices, because right now e-waste is becoming a very, very big thing. Yeah. But again, we have a global e-waste crisis that people don't fully grasp until you actually walk around here and see how serious it's happening. Actually, when you look at the stats, the world actually currently generates over 50 million tons of e-waste. That's a crazy number. Yeah. And it's growing at, about 4% annually, and less than 20% gets formally recycled. So where does this other 30% go? Okay, it's a worry. When you go to the beach, for example, at the coast, you see a lot of this waste, all over. the other day here we had crazy flooding. All this waste imetoka wapi? Yeah? So the rest of this waste that is not recycled always ends up in, landfills. It ends up in, blocking our drainage system, for example, here in Nairobi, and that's before you account for even just that massive carbon footprints, manufacturing new devices actually, takes. So I think, that's one underrated, idea I think will blow up in the coming years. So the right to repair legislation is actually coming to effect. We've seen a lot of companies trying to implement, recycling policies. So hopefully that will help.
Yeah.
But I think in the coming years, for example, let's look at 5 or even 10 years, I think buying a refurbished device will be a mainstream. These days, we have startups actually doing refurbished phones. There's one Apachini we worked with before. What's her name? Is it Adili? What are they called? Badili, yes, Badili. They recycle phones. They have a very nice plant just here at Chiromo, right? So, and they sell those phones. So, again, 5 years, we'll see a lot of refurbished devices being sold. It become a mainstream thing, so you don't have to buy something new. These days, when you buy a phone, for example, from companies like Samsung, they sell you without a charger in the box. Why? Because they know ulikuwa na simu nyingine mahali which is a type C, so use that same charger kucharge hiyo simu.
Yeah.
So usikuwe na mabox. Kitambo tulikuwa tunaenjoy sana kuwa na mabox mingi zimejaa hapo na charger. But companies are selling devices without chargers these days because hawataki zote ziende away. So I think the startups that are building this infrastructure for recycling, for that transition, they're the ones that are really undervalued right now. But, just moving forward, we expect them to actually reap big from, this particular, idea.
And as we almost move to the end, what are some uniquely African climate solutions that the rest of the world can learn from? Because I believe in Africa, we have a lot of startups which are created to solve different challenges facing African nations. So what do you think are some of the African climate solutions that the rest of the world can copy from?
That's a very interesting and also tough question. And I love it because, the direction of learning, so often gets assumed to flow from, north to south. Like people always think like, Africans can't develop their own solutions. But again, the reality is some of the most innovative climate adaptation thinking and solutions actually happening right here, at home, right here in Africa. And of course, when you look at, for example, initiatives like the Green Wall initiatives, that's a very nice plan to grow 8,000 natural barriers across full width of Africa to hold the Sahara, to hold the, Sahara Desert. So I think one thing I like about that initiative is the fact that it's not just an ambition, but it's a model that is just fundamentally just community-led. Come together, let's build this. Here locally, we've seen, for example, banks like A&M Bank with their, it's called Project Imarisha, I think, where they're trying to restore Ngong Forest. Such kind of initiatives actually, I think we need the world to learn from here in Africa. And actually, the best way to refer to it is ecological restorations. We've seen forests being cut down. We've seen the other day Karura being grabbed and, trees being cut down. But again, that's how do we restore those forests? So I think that's one area that I think, that we've seen being implemented here. Not really governments, because they're the ones cutting down the trees. Kitambo used to see a story, Mau forest being grabbed and trees being cut. I live in an area where every night there's a big forest behind our home, and I only see every night kuna lorries zinapita hapo zimetoka kata mamiti huko. So but again, how do we restore these ecological these forests, right? Then another thing has to be things around green finance. Green finance is very, very big locally here. We've seen banks invest massively. Banks are willing to lend money to green startups. They're willing to lend money to customers that are big on green. So if you want to put solar in your home, walk to your bank, they'll be willing to give you money to actually, implement that. Then they say a third one will be things, for example, like, mobile first climate finance. We've seen things like microfinancing. Easy masola as M-Pesa, masola as M-Kopa.
Yeah.
How do those people pay? They pay through M-Pesa, right? So in fact, it's always called the M-Pesa climate financing, right? So you have all these companies, wanakuambia, take this solar product or this energy product, then be paying every month with your M-Pesa 20 bob pesa ngapi? It depends, 20 bob, or, pay all those things. So that's, and M-Pesa actually in Kenya, for example, didn't just change payments. It has also created, an infrastructure for these companies, your micro insurance, micro solar financing, they pay as you go, renewable energy products. Yeah, pay as you go. So pay as you use. So the more natumia, the more nalipa. Yeah. So it has created that infrastructure for them, reaching tens of millions of people, who are previously just excluded from the financial systems. The M-Kopa model, as I said earlier, is a very good point to learn, financing solar home systems through mobile payments, and this has been replicated actually across, Southeast Asia and even Latin America. So when you look at it, Africa exported this innovation to this country, right? Basically, I think those are what I think for top of my head right now, which I think, the rest of the world need to learn from Africa, from those three solutions, climate solutions.
And what role does local knowledge play in building sustainable tech solution? Considering, as you said earlier, that most of the African startups build like with the communities. They just don't create something out of nowhere. Like they usually involve the communities around. So what role does it help in building sustainable tech solutions?
And knowledge is actually very important in anything when you look at it, right? So, in fact, in this context, right, it's often the difference between a solution that works and one that doesn't. Okay, and this is something that, of course, the tech industry, with its tendency towards, let me call it towards universalism, is actually, are slowly learning. So a lot of climate tech, is designed for, it's designed for wealthy countries, right? Yeah. Wealthy countries, context, and then deployed to now developing markets like Africa or like Kenya, right? So that assumption embedded in the design, of course, of reliable electricity, high literacy, broadband connectivity, formalized land ownership, stable currency, they don't hold in many African, Asian, or even Latin American contexts. But, when those solutions fail, it's often attributed to implementation challenges, right? They fail because, for example, we didn't get the support from governments. We hear people crying like, serikali tusaidie, they didn't help us. When actually, the problem was design failure, right? Yeah. So you create a product, but again, is it really designed for this market? So a failure to incorporate that local knowledge from the start is what makes a lot of these, startups fail. The most actually effective sustainable tech builders, I've seen treat local knowledge as a very important need, and just the first part of them trying to set up a business in a particular area. So it's actually a very serious need. So again, that means when you need that local knowledge, it means having to hire a local community, doing that deep feasibility of just on-ground research, building feedback loops that elevate community voices and product decisions. You see things happen. Commonly story it's coastal Kenya where they were building ilikuwa nini? Where was it? Is it coal mining or something?
Oh yeah.
Yes. Unasema people say, no, you are not consulted. There's no public participation.
I think there's also one for nuclear.
Exactly. Yeah, in Kakamega, right?
No, in Kilifi.
Kilifi, yeah. Oh, Kakamega was gold. You know, no, you are not consulted. So, we will just show up because umeambiwa na, for example, umepewa go ahead na the government, unakuja, but the community has a totally different understanding of things. So, yeah, the communities that actually have lived in those ecosystems for generations, carry that knowledge about the ecosystem. So it's up to you to talk to them. They understand the ecosystem, they understand the science. So it helps you get that local knowledge. That will just help you build sustainable tech solutions for that particular
I think I also recall 2 years ago in Kilifi.
Yes.
There's this place where they're having those big stones. So apparently there's a cement company that wanted to take over the place because of the cement that's already there. But the locals were refusing.
Yes.
Because they were saying first it's going to disrupt the activities going on like schools, churches, and the locals. But then still there's that kind of conflict between the locals and the company and the government.
Yeah, because we never take serious public participations, and not just even in this particular issue, after all the other things. We've seen a lot of policies happen. After when you look, for example, when you were in the street last year, one of the things that was being said was, no, mulisema hii, but there were no public participations. If you're willing to increase these taxes, let us know, call us to ambia this. But when you can't just wake up and decide, no, let me go implement this project here, without actually talking to the people that you want to use those products. So it can't work. It can't work. So you just need to go get that local knowledge for you to actually just implement whatever product you want to implement.
And that brings us to the end of today's podcast on tech and climate change activism. And any closing remarks?
Closing remarks? Nothing really, but I think one thing that I really hope to see being scaled globally, one of the climate innovation that I really want to see being scaled globally, because I've seen it working here, has to be the pay-as-you-go clean energy model. Specifically the ecosystem of distributed renewable energy infrastructure that is built around mobile payments and data-driven credit. I mean, it's working here in Kenya nicely because we have the ecosystem, and M-Pesa is working very nicely. And I hope that that's what I want to see being implemented locally. But yeah, closing remarks, really nothing much. But I think thanks so much for these conversations. I'm your first guest.
Yeah.
Jesus, I'm your first guest. But of course, we look forward to having these conversations and just even working in-house to highlight more around this particular topic, because it's a very interesting topic of interest for us. We have a role to play, right? Yeah. As journalists, we have a role to play. As Africa, we have a role to play, not just as victims of climate change, but as innovators, as storytellers, and as powerful voices for just the global conversation around the global climate governance and implementation. So thank you so much, Toida, for these conversations and for the podcast. I rarely appear on podcasts myself, and I host podcasts. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for also attending. I was your host, Tauhida Ali. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and comment. See you on the next episode.